Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. We invite you into the stories, struggles, and breakthroughs shaping the future of human health. From cutting-edge brain science to discoveries transforming how we heal, adapt, and thrive. We explore the ideas that matter and the people behind them. Together, we look across diseases, technology, and research fields to understand not just what is changing, but why it matters for patients, families, and the future we all share. Join us as we uncover new insights, spark collaboration, and illuminate the science that can improve our lives. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of health science. Joining me today is David Zakariaie, founder and CEO of Sensei, where he is pioneering the use of AI and ocular-based biometrics to bring objective, measurable diagnostics to mental health. So welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You have a fascinating story, and it goes all the way back to high school. Tell me about how Sensei actually started as a high school project.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the focus wasn't originally on mental health, but, as you hinted at, kind of the original underpinnings of Sensei started as my high school science fair project. And the way the idea came to be, so kind of when I was in late middle school, early high school, I was like, the iPhone had been out for a couple of years, the, App Store was out. And it was kind of that sweet spot where there wasn't a lot of competition. And so you could really kind of make any stupid game or app and make some sort of money. And so for lack of anything better to call it, that was essentially my high school job. I taught myself how to code and was building kind of different games for the App Store and Google Play. And by virtue of that, I was able to secure a ticket in 2012 as a 10th grader, or I guess it was a 9th grader, I don't know. But, to attend the Google Developer Conference that year. And the 2012 they called it Google I/O. At that conference, they announced Google Glass, and it was like this big thing. And just by virtue of being, the right place at the right time, those of us that were at that conference were able to sign up to be kind of the first group of folks to receive a pair of Google Glass. And it kind of went by order of how you got in line. And so the closer you were to the back of the room, you got in line sooner, you got a lower number, and you got it first. And I think I was number 571, something like that. But there was like a glass block that we got that basically, like, that's what they handed us that day, is like, here's your block and here's your number. And so long story short, I was one of the first folks that received a pair of Google Glass. And if you remember Google Glass, as cool as it was, they basically got, a functioning computer inside of a pair of glasses. The one thing that I always thought was really dumb was that the best idea they had for how to interact with it was to basically slap a mouse pad on the side of your head. And so that initially got me very interested in kind of the evolution of interface technology over time. So how we went from a keyboard on a typewriter to a mouse on a PC to a touchscreen on a cell phone, and so on and so forth. And naturally, because Google Glass was a pair of glasses, it got me really interested in the eyes. And Google Glass didn't really go anywhere, but it had already kind of sent me down that journey of realizing, there's close to 100 years of scientific literature that talks about all these different cognitive, emotional, and psychological states that people are able to detect solely off the dilation of the pupil, but that no one's really able to do anything with it for two reasons. One, because the pupil is just one black circle that gets bigger or smaller for tens of thousands of reasons, including just a change in light. And unless you're in a highly controlled laboratory setting, it's really difficult to isolate why that's happening. And two, to have the privilege of measuring it in the first place, you got to spend a lot of money on a high-end eye tracking system. And if you wanted to measure more things than just a pupil, you'd have to, perhaps purchase a couple different eye tracking systems, because not one eye tracker could measure all these things. And so that was really the initial inspiration for Sensei. It was more to kind of solve that technical challenge. And so the focus was on trying to find more variables in the eye we could measure that could not just give us more information, but also help us differentiate and understand why changes in the pupil are happening. And then the second part of it was finding a way to do it with cheap commercial off-the-shelf cameras instead of these really large eye trackers. And so that was kind of the initial focus for Sensei. I started the company kind of focused on that in 2015.
And so I have to, like, I got to stop you. So when you went to Google I/O,
Yeah,
like, were you the youngest one there?
I'm sure. I remember I couldn't go to the after party because I wasn't 21, and I was really annoyed about it because they had hired Train to play, and this was like back in the day when Train, that was the hit band of that time. But I remember when I asked someone, like, they hadn't designed the system to be like, if you're under 18 you can't come to this conference. I think they just weren't expecting that someone was going to try. But yeah, somehow I was able to convince my parents to let me go to San Francisco alone at 15, and it worked out.
So so that's amazing. And then you just casually said, I got interested in the eye. Like, you're in high school, right?
Yeah.
Or who gets casually fascinated with the eye in high school and then goes through all these publications of 100 years worth of publications?
Yeah, I mean, saying I found the oldest one was 100 years. I wouldn't say I actually looked through all the 100 years. I more kind of consolidated the hypothesis, but there wasn't like this like smooth, intentional, like a method of like how this all came to be. It just kind of like it was a combination of like I wasn't really interested in school. Like I was a student, like I got A's and D's. There was no middle ground, and it was just a function of did I care about the topic. Because if I got a D, it was because I would still get a good grade on the test, but I would not bother doing any of the homework because I just didn't care. As soon as school actually became difficult, that's how it was. I only paid attention to stuff I wanted to. And I actually left high school after 10th grade. They've changed the way it works now, but I went to school in California, and there used to be a test called the CHESP. And basically, after your first semester of 10th grade, you could take it, and it was equivalent to a high school diploma if you graduated. And so yeah, I don't know. It was just kind of, for me, it was the logical steps of like, this seemed really interesting and I wanted to see where it goes. But like, there was no grand plan. I was kind of just following and seeing what happens, and just, yeah, it turned into, it eventually turned into what Sensei is now. But yeah, there was no
Yeah.
master plan.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And then, you've talked a little bit about Sensei today. It wasn't always on mental health. Kind of talk about the evolution, because you were
Yeah.
working this problem with the eye and some of the interfaces. What have, kind of those major evolutions?
Yeah, absolutely. So the focus on Sensei for the first 5, 6 years was just kind of solving this technical challenge. And the primary reason why most and we do a lot more than just eye tracking, but like pupillometry and eye tracking is the hardest piece of it technically to measure with a normal video camera. And the reason why is in people with darker eyes, like you have perfect eyes for this, but like in my eyes and above, it becomes very difficult to draw the boundary with a normal video camera between the iris and the pupil, because the shades, but by the time you zoom into the eye, that the shades of black, or the brown and black, look very, very similar. And so that was kind of the big technical challenge that we had to figure out how to solve. And so as we were working on that, we kind of chased various contract and grant opportunities that we saw to kind of build different things in the eye tracking space. And obviously, like, we delivered on those projects, but at the same time, it was also providing us funding to build this way of doing eye tracking in the first place. So like one of the first programs we did, we were part of an Air Force program called Pilot Training Next. And there were a couple things it was kind of working to accomplish, but the basic idea behind it was they wanted to be able to dramatically compress the amount of time it takes to train a pilot in the Air Force. And there were kind of two overarching ideas that were a part of it. The first was these new virtual reality platforms are dirt cheap. So if you pay 10 grand for a virtual reality flight simulator instead of 2-3 million for a full flight simulator, every student can basically have their own flight simulator. And so they can kind of get a much larger number of reps. And then the second piece of it was like, can you train to proficiency in a more objective manner than just kind of saying, everyone does a certain number of hours on these particular tasks. And so we had built the capability to measure cognitive load off of the eyes, and essentially installed eye tracking cameras inside of the VR headsets, and that kind of became the way of measuring cognitive load and kind of the early versions of that.
So what is
program.
cognitive load? What is cognitive load?
Yeah, cognitive load is basically just a measure of how hard the brain is working at that particular task, or how hard the brain is working at that a moment in time. And we were essentially using it as a proxy for understanding when someone has learned something, because the essential idea was that in that specific situation where you're learning how to fly inside of a flight simulator, everything is recorded and measured because it's basically a video game, and all that data is available. And so you can kind of perfectly understand from a performance standpoint how performance is going up, and we could provide a measurement of how cognitive load is going down over that particular task. And so if someone is learning how to fly a particular maneuver inside of a VR environment where performance goes up and cognitive load goes down, where those two meet in the middle, is essentially like the objective definition of they've learned something. And so that was kind of why we were measuring cognitive load. And that concept of learning in that way was not new. What was new was kind of using eye tracking instead of, a EEG as the way of trying to measure cognitive load.
What is the physical about the eye tracking that equates to the cognitive load to the brain? Like, what is that?
Yeah, so cognitive load specifically is one of the more rudimentary things that we were measuring. It was primarily looking at changes in pupil dynamics. Where it gets complicated is filtering and figuring out pupil changes specifically because of what's going on in cognitive load versus, they're in a VR headset, the lighting is changing a million times. But we're primarily looking at kind of at metrics having to do with the dilation of the pupil.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you did this project for the Air Force around this. It's helping you build the eye tracking capability and your understanding of the eye. Where did you go next?
Yeah, so we did kind of two things next. We tried building a lie detector. That was a fun one, but it was also very difficult to validate because there's no way in a IRB controlled, like properly done research study to really simulate the risk of like the consequences of lying. And so that was kind of a fun thing we worked on. And then kind of the other big thing that we were working on that eventually kind of led to the pivot into mental health, we did a project with Lloyd's Register and PIL. PIL is a large container shipping company based in Singapore. They're one of kind of the larger container ship companies. And Lloyd's Register is the ship classification society. I don't know what the right word is. It's not society, but anyways. And they were looking for a operational risk management platform that could take psychological risk, into effect as well. So, taking a breathalyzer test to find out, if a sailor on duty is drunk is very easy. Trying to figure out if someone is fatigued is a little bit more difficult, but not impossible. But something that can do both of those and then also kind of assess for psychological risk, that was the difficult part. And they weren't looking for like a risk in like a malintent kind of a way. It was more of like they were looking for scenarios where like something is going on at home, you're just away on a container ship for 30 days, like different things that can kind of have you being distracted when you're the only guy or gal on duty that night. And that was very important because I think there had been a series in the broader industry, there had been a series of accidents that was one of the primary reasons why. And I think, and this was the year that, what was it? I think it was the USS John McCain and one of the other big naval vessels that had kind of had high profile collisions as well. And so it was like a very big topic. And so we had kind of built a early prototype for them of like, it wasn't on a cell phone. It was the big bulky system, but basically it was like a panel mounted eye tracking system we would put on the bridge of the ship. And it was a way to kind of assess impairment across those different categories. And there was kind of two things that happened that then led to us moving to mental health. The first was psychological risk factors, at least the way they were looking for. We couldn't really find a way to do it. But the more we were delving into it, it became very clear that there's a lot of literature to support actually diagnosing and measuring mental health this way. And then at the same time, we were approached by a pharmaceutical company that was working on, they were doing very early work on psychedelics for like opioid use disorder and ADHD and a couple other things. And they were very interested in seeing if our technology could kind of serve as some sort of a companion diagnostic for the drug they were developing for opioid use disorder, because they wanted to understand if the person's actually getting better or not in response to the drug. And then they also wanted to see, because the maintenance therapy that is given in a rehab environment also has some opioid components to it. Do you have a way of telling us for sure, are they on the maintenance therapy or have they relapsed on whatever the actual, problem drug was? And so those two things kind of came together. We had talked about doing some sort of a companion diagnostic deal with that pharma company. The commercial terms just didn't really make any sense at all. And so, but throughout that due diligence process with them, we realized, hang on, like we can actually maybe build a diagnostic for these conditions in the first place. This is a much larger opportunity than just kind of building one thing for this particular drug. And so those two things kind of coming together is what kind of led us in late 2020, early 2021 being like, okay, like we built the technology, it works. It's now time to kind of, apply it to something. And we kind of pivoted the company fully after the mental health opportunity at that point.
Let me go back to when you did this on the big chips. You said it was kind of a big and bulky sensor that was, across the room.
Yeah.
How can that be, right? It's big. How is it working when your eyes are 6, 8, 10 feet away? Like, how does that work? Because it seems to be a pretty precision on the eye.
So it was a giant. So to be clear, I know we haven't really talked in detail yet about the way the technology works, but everything we're doing is active measurement. So we show stimuli and we measure your eye's response to it. Like there's not really a covert way to measure any of the things that we're doing, because we're measuring your brain's response to things via the eye. And then in the case of mental health or fatigue or whatever it may be, we're measuring your brain's response in the way a fatigued brain or a depressed brain or whatever brain will respond is different than a, control brain, to kind of use the...
So the guys would come on the ship and they would go through a series of tests. It would test it. Okay, so it wasn't an independent kind of a proactive system that was out there surveilling and searching. It was...
That's correct, yeah.
You're coming in maybe every 4 hours, you're doing another test, you're seeing how
it's funny you say 4 hours, because that's actually how the shift cycle worked on the container ship. So it was kind of every 4 hours, whatever officers were on duty, it was like at the entrance of the bridge, they would go, they take the test and they go from there.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's dig into the technology then that you've got right now, because it is, you've talked about it being on your phone, it's mental health. Where are you at today with the technology?
Yeah, so the product that we're building right now, we're building the first diagnostic and severity monitoring platform for behavioral health. And our initial focus is on PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And there have been a lot of previous attempts to kind of try and quantify mental health. And besides for the technology, which I'll explain in a second, the biggest way that we differentiate ourselves from a lot of previous attempts is that we really don't think you can change the clinical journey, or by that, the outcomes of patients, unless you can establish a real gold standard in this space. And so we are purposely pursuing, a regulatory path through the FDA as a diagnostic for all the indication that we're focused on, which is not to say you can't use it as a screening tool, but we think it's very important that we hit the bar of this is a diagnostic in the eyes of the FDA. So the way the product works, the first time a patient interacts with it, it's a roughly 10.5-minute test. I say roughly just because depending on how long you pause at certain points, it can go a bit longer. But we show different types of ocular stimuli on the screen of the phone while we videotape your eye's response to it. And then on the other side of that, we spit out a binary diagnosis and a severity score. There's kind of three main types of ocular stimuli that we're showing. The first is kind of calibration style tasks, I would call it. So kind of, if you imagine like a, old school Palm Pilot, except instead of calibrating a stylus, you're kind of following the dots with your eyes. The second in the bulk of the test is kind of different tasks around affective image viewing. So we show different blocks of images at different levels of emotional valence. And we are measuring in a kind of time series manner your eye's response over the course of us showing those images. And then there's a pupillary light reflex task as well. And then within each individual image, we're also looking at things like, your gaze patterns and fixations. And so it's kind of both what happens in each individual task plus all the tasks put together. And then we do a pupillary light reflex task at the end of each of those image blocks as well. And that's another place where, depending on how we loaded your nervous system with those images, we do see differences in the PLR response as well. So that kind of test happens for about 10.5 minutes. And then on the other side of that, we can spit out the diagnosis and the severity score. We're also working on a shorter version of a test that you can take as often as the clinician would like you to kind of probably a max of once a week, so that you can also see how that severity is changing over time. So if you're receiving any type of treatment, it becomes either a very powerful way to titrate certain treatments if they're, a drug, and or like the way we measure progress right now is you just kind of ask the patient, well, do you feel any better now? Do you want to increase your dose? And so it becomes a more objective way to actually kind of see if they're responding or not. And then in terms of what we're measuring over the course of that 10-minute test in response to all the stimuli, there's kind of three main categories. The first is all the kind of traditional ocular metrics you would normally associate. All the ocular metrics you would normally associate with an eye tracker. So things like pupil size, blink, saccades, gaze, eye movement. The second is slightly more novel. We measure changes in the dilator and the sphincter of the iris. It's very rudimentary, the metrics we're getting around this, but the important thing is that the dilator is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system and the sphincter by the parasympathetic. And so it's just a fancy way of saying we get a lot more granularity into what part of the nervous system we've actually activated. And then the third is heart rate and heart rate variability off the face. And so across those three categories, we measure about 45 individual metrics. We feed those into our models, and then that's what we use to deliver a diagnosis and a severity score. And from a neuroscience standpoint, very little of this is actually new. Almost all of this has been very well established in the scientific literature for some time now. The problem has been, like, if you go do a Google Scholar search and let's say type in, PTSD and ocular metrics, you'll find 4 or 5 papers that talk about PTSD and blinks, and then 4 or 5 papers that talk about PTSD and pupil size, and so on and so forth. But the technology has not existed to take this multimodal approach. And so our breakthrough is less to do with the fundamental science, and it's more we've built the computer vision to be able to measure all these things simultaneously.
Yeah, that's awesome. And you're in clinical trials now, right? How many?
Yes.
So I guess my first question is, how many people have you tested this on before you went into trial? And then what does the trial look like, and when do you come out of the trials?
Yeah, so we're just started. We kind of just started our phase 3 clinical trial a month ago, which, if anyone is interested, if you go to mentalhealthstudy.org, I don't know how we got that domain name, but if you go to mentalhealthstudy.org, you can sign up for our trial. There is a virtual component to it, so you can do it as long as you're in the US. You can do it. But our phase 3 trial started on February 22nd. For this PTSD diagnostic app, I'd say roughly 16,000 people went through it before we started our phase 3. And that was across kind of a couple of programs. So we did like a phase 1 trial that was 68 patients. We did a phase 2 study that was about 750 patients. And then at the end of the day, if you ignore all the neuroscience, we're basically building a AI algorithm. And so like anything, the more data, the better. And so we did a large training study to basically get as much additional data for the algorithm as possible, both to train the algorithm with more data, as well as to kind of test different variations of the app to figure out what the best version of it was. And so that study was roughly 15,000 patients. And then the phase 3 study just started. There's kind of two components to it, or I should say 3 components to it. There is the kind of first piece of it, which we're still allowed to train the algorithm while we're going through it. That's the first 1,900 patients. There's then an additional 400 patients, which is our pivotal set. And those are the final set of patients that we'll validate the algorithm on. And then we are getting additional data for the algorithm as well. We're doing another pre-training study of roughly 14,000 patients. And so when all is said and done and we kind of submit this to the FDA, hopefully by the end of the year, it will have been trained on roughly 30,000 or so patients worth of data. And I know someone will probably comment on this of like, well, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 language technically doesn't apply to medical device, but like there's no equivalent of that in medical device. And so I have found it's just a very easy way to describe what we're doing since it's still kind of phased.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And that is for PTSD. Do you have to go through the whole thing again for anxiety or depression?
It won't be quite as cumbersome for anxiety and depression because we actually have a lot of anxiety and depression data already. So PTSD is highly comorbid with anxiety and depression. I think what the literature suggests, and certainly our studies have shown as well, is about 90% of patients that have PTSD have comorbid anxiety and or depression. And so one of the really important questions to answer is, well, if all your PTSD patients have depression or anxiety, how do you know that you haven't accidentally built a depression or anxiety diagnostic, but you're just calling it PTSD and it looks like it works because they all have PTSD? And so the only way to do that is to also study anxiety and depression at the same time. And so on our current trial design, we have large control groups that are anxiety and depression patients. And so we do know that the test results, like we are able to differentiate someone that has PTSD versus someone that has PTSD and comorbid depression and anxiety versus someone that just has depression or anxiety. So we don't false positive them as having PTSD. How good are we though right now at diagnosing anxiety and depression without making any changes to the app? We don't know yet. I would assume we have to make some additions to it, but depending on kind of how good we are at it already, once we can answer that will kind of indicate how cumbersome it's going to be to kind of expand our indications to also include anxiety and depression.
So if you get the FDA approval at the end of the year, what is the next steps?
Yeah, so and I'll say, so we're expecting submitting to the FDA towards the end of the year. We don't expect approval until kind of sometime in 2027. But yeah, from there we can kind of start selling this thing. And I'll kind of explain our go-to-market strategy, but our hope is to kind of generate a level of revenue that will allow us to kind of continue to develop the rest of the indications out. So I don't know which way you want to take the conversation. I can talk about the business model. I can talk about what comes next from a tech standpoint, or both. But you let me know which order to go.
Let's talk about both. Let's talk about both.
Yeah. So in terms of the go-to-market strategy, and I'm not the expert on this. I have experts on our team, but I think almost anyone in the healthcare space will probably tell you like diagnostics is the least sexy business that exists. And I've come to learn why, but investors, insurance companies, people don't seem to like diagnostics. Like we'll spend $1 bajillion on drugs as soon as they come out, but the uptake for diagnostics is just not there. And something that I didn't realize until starting this, how many conditions there are FDA approved drugs that get prescribed that cost a whole lot of money, but there's no diagnostic test for those conditions. So even like in Alzheimer's and dementia, there are these new classes of drugs that are getting approved, but we don't actually have a great way of knowing yet if someone actually has either one of those, indications. And so all that is to say, it's a very murky world in the diagnostic space, but there's kind of two pieces to our go-to-market. The dream for any diagnostics or medical device company is to kind of end up with a medical coverage policy from, any number or all of the major payers. And while that is also our goal, it takes a long time. And so part of what we've been trying to figure out is, well, if we can't get in a coverage policy for, Aetna until 4 or 5 years post FDA approval, can we see if there's other ways to get at those same lives? And this is where the fact that we're 100% software comes into advantage, because so much of mental health, even if the payers are paying for it, is taking place on telehealth. And a lot of these payers are outsourcing their mental health clinician networks to folks like, Talkspace and BetterHelp and Spring Health and Lyra Health. And depending on the payer, whether it's, an insurer or an employer, they're picking these different platforms, but a lot of those patients are being serviced on those platforms. And so if we go make a deal with that platform and get incorporated as a diagnostic and severity tool on that platform, it's another way of getting at the same lives, essentially. And that's something we can do that most diagnostic companies can't, because we're just an app on a phone. There's no hardware. And, in the case of like a Spring Health or a Teladoc, you can even just take our software as a plugin and directly incorporate it inside your app. So it's not even a separate app. And so that's kind of our focus from a distribution strategy, is trying to plug in through telehealth as much as we can. And so that's kind of our go-to-market strategy on the fee-for-service side. And there are existing CPT codes and some on the diagnostic as well as the severity monitoring side that we have validated we're able to use for our product at the point that we're FDA approved. And then there's also an opportunity on the value-based care side of things, where there are certain parts of value-based care where you're required to do mental health screening or diagnosis, and it becomes very important to kind of understand how severe someone is, because some of those value-based care contracts have like a 7 or 14-day period of time where if you are depressed with a certain level, they have to get them into mental health care. And then there's another side of value-based care where, and I don't know the best way to pitch this, but basically, like, there are incentives for health systems to go find patients that are sick, essentially, because when the Affordable Care Act was passed, this whole HCC scoring system was built that, if we're forcing an insurance company to cover someone with pre-existing conditions, if they have certain pre-existing conditions, the government, on marketplace plans and certain Medicare and Medicaid plans will pay that insurance company a fixed amount of money to kind of subsidize for the fact that they are taking care of a sicker patient. And so that created the reverse incentive structure of, well, let's go find sicker patients, because if we, the more sicker patients we find, we can kind of get that HCC uplift, is what they call it. And so that's the other part of this that we're figuring out. It is obviously, from our perspective, like, it's great the health system is going to get more money for finding that patient, but they get the more money to treat the more patients. So the incentives are aligned as long as the money is actually used to treat the patient, which I'm not saying they wouldn't use it for that, but that kind of seems like one of the best ways to both kind of scale the business, but also find as many patients as possible. Because, what I've learned, you probably know this better than, anyone, is like, as much as healthcare is about like kumbaya and save lives, it really is all about money at the end of the day. And the incentives have to be aligned. Like, everyone needs to either make more money or make money and save money. And so we're trying to find the go-to-market strategy, at least initially, that is as close to that as possible to kind of, make it be something that everyone wants to, the patients want to use, the doctors will get paid, the payers will get paid, the health system overall will save money. So we're kind of
and save lives
together. And save lives. And that's what lives, right? Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm most excited about. I think, like, if you go talk to a health system, that's what the chief medical officer is most excited about. But I've just learned, like, if it's like, we're going to save more lives, but also we're going to 10x your costs, it's never going to get anywhere. It's just the reality of it. And so I'm still super optimistic. I've just also learned you have to play the game.
Yeah, no, I understand that. It definitely. So you mentioned the technology, and where you're going with the technology, and I'm curious because you did mention like Alzheimer's and dementias. Is this might the technology at someday be able to test for cognitive decline, that 20, 30 years before it ever starts happening, so that we have a diagnostic for that too?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is we're looking at it. We don't yet know what's possible. So there's obviously like even in the neurodegenerative space, there is a lot of kind of eye-based assessments right now already. Whether you're using kind of OCT to scan the back of the retina, or there are some other companies and startups that are trying to do eye tracking type things for neurodegenerative disorders, but it's inside of a VR headset or some sort of other kind of more sophisticated piece of equipment. So the short answer is I think there is a lot we can do in the neurodegenerative space, and it's something that we're looking at and starting to collect data in. There are certainly trade-offs when you start to use a phone in that space, because in the neurodegenerative space, like precision of the measurements becomes a lot more important than it is in mental health. It's easier to deal with it in mental health, but like the fact that it's a phone and the lighting can be different every day and things like that makes it more difficult for that. So is there something we can do in that space? Absolutely, especially because I think what we lose in specificity of measurement versus an MRI or an OCT or even like an eye tracking in a VR headset, we gain in the fact that it's a phone app, so someone can take the test every day if it's a really short test, or every week, or whatever the right interval is, but you can never do an MRI or an OCT or something like that at that type of scale and quantity. But what exactly is possible, I don't know yet. So can it be like an early onset diagnostic? Can it be a diagnostic when symptoms are very obvious? Can it maybe not be a diagnostic, but we can do very accurate severity monitoring? I don't know yet. And part of why we started with mental health first, I mean, personally, it is something I'm more personally passionate about, but also it's an easier problem to solve from a clinical trial standpoint. Because if we're going to build an early onset diagnostic, I have not figured out a way to collect that data other than do a very large prospective study where you have to follow people in their 20s and 30s, and you got to follow enough people that they develop, something in the neurodegenerative space 10, 15 years down the line, and then go back and analyze and see if there were signs of it. So it's a much longer process, I think, to kind of build that out. But yeah, we certainly want to expand both in terms of what we can do in mental health, but then also kind of try and build this and turn this into an overall measurement platform for as much of brain health and neuroscience as possible. And certainly not everything is possible. There's a wall somewhere, but I don't think we know where the wall is.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's downsides tracking 20, 30, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds. If just the idea that something would come back and said, oh, you've got a little bit of cognitive decline might actually change your behavior in a way that is not good. So
for sure,
I would imagine there's some downside. So what is kind of the next thing after, PTSD, anxiety, depression? What is it? Where are you taking that technology pipeline?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say we have like a completely set pipeline, but kind of on the mental health side, the next conditions that we're thinking about are schizophrenia, bipolar, and perhaps ADHD. I think that there's some more work we need to do in pilot studies if we're kind of locking down the exact conditions we're going to go after next. But yeah, in terms of mental health, that's kind of where we're focused on, at least from a condition standpoint. And then I think kind of the other way that we think about kind of growing the business and expanding the value of what we're building is, so, if you imagine, I don't know, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, let's say tens of millions or hopefully hundreds of millions of patients a year are being diagnosed and their severity is being tracked through our system. And, as the only mental health diagnostic, we're going to have a level of data and insight into what happens in mental health that no one else is going to have. From a population health management standpoint, we can understand what conditions are most pervasive where. We'll understand the true time and cost from like an insurable standpoint to kind of treat these conditions, what drugs work, which ones don't, which telehealth platforms work. We can hopefully get to the point of actually understanding all the subtypes of these things, because as much as we say PTSD or major depression, there's really kind of 5 or 6 conditions in each of these that, look very different. That's probably why people respond to drugs very differently. So not that we, sell that data set, but I think once we have that data set, that enables us to kind of figure out what chapter 2, 3, and 4 is. And so, I don't know what they are because I don't know what the data says yet, but I think there's a lot we can kind of build if we have that data set of really understanding what is happening in this space.
It's interesting, and I don't know if you meant that, the people are, if they're using it, just take for example, around the United States, is there clusters of area that has higher mental health issues? Then when you drill down, is there a location that is close to some sort of environmentally not friendly, place, right? Is there chemicals on farms or whatever?
Is there an event that happened?
Exactly.
Can it all be traced back to a hurricane or a fire? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of those things become possible.
You would be, pulling that data off of the human too, where they
Absolutely.
Okay. What are kind of their journey of life, if you would.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So we in no way, shape, or form are trying to replace the clinician. And certainly, we're able to give, to point to this person has PTSD as an example without them having to make a trauma disclosure, which typically is one of the biggest reasons why PTSD goes misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. But we're not trying to replace the human element of this. You as a clinician should absolutely still kind of have conversations with the patient. We're just trying to put a very powerful diagnostic tool in your hands. Because in most cases, how to treat the patient if you know what they have, but we just want to give you a very accurate insight into what is the condition that they are suffering from, and B, how is it responding over time to whatever intervention plan has been worked out.
Yeah. I read somewhere that you said, if we can't measure something, we can't fix it. And maybe you just kind of address the what do you think is broken in our mental health, that's currently diagnosed? Does this help that because it is measuring it?
Yeah, I mean, so it's I think the entire mental health system is screwed up personally, but I think the one part of it that is really, really good is you have, for the most part, amazing clinicians that care about what they're doing and actually want to help their patients. I've come across less than 1% of clinicians that I would say don't care about what they're doing. Certainly, there are clinicians that perhaps are not good, and that's that's a different story. But I think that for the most part, no one goes into mental health for the money. It's not I think we're going to build a bunch of mental health diagnostics, throw them into the world, and then the whole mental health system is is kind of overnight fixed. That will not happen. There are so many things that have to be fixed, but I see no way whatsoever to fix any of the problems if you can't fix this fundamental measurement problem first. If someone had solved measurement first, we would go build all these other things on top of it. But I think that fundamental measurement layer has to be fixed because, it's a lot of the published literature talks about the best diagnosed mental health condition in the US is major depression. And that's misdiagnosed about 65% of the time. And depression is relatively simple to diagnose compared to any of the other conditions. Then you get to things like PTSD, bipolar, schizophrenia, which are primarily still diagnosed in primary care. And you see that misdiagnosis rate skyrocket to between 84 and 92%, depending on the condition. And I don't think that's anyone's fault. It's just the reality of a system that's purely based on patient self-reporting, especially when the symptoms, unless someone is in a severe manic episode, most of the time, when I've talked to patients and they describe their symptoms, they all sound the same. And if you look in the DSM, I think it would be very difficult to differentiate depression from anxiety to PTSD unless the person actually made a trauma disclosure. So it's not I think the fact that mental health is so, that mental health care is so poor right now is anyone's fault. It's just there is no good measurement in the space. And so we solve the measurement problem. We put very powerful measurement tools in the hands of the clinicians that are doing all this work. And then I think slowly you can build on top of that. But if you don't know what someone has and you don't know how they're getting better, it's such a, excuse me, it's a mind fuck for me to understand how that could even work. And the analog I always use, when we do a decent amount of work with the military, and the way I always talk about it, in the military is hey, you go to war, someone gets shot. that entire cycle from getting shot to either getting discharged or getting sent back out is incredibly visible, right? Like there's a hole in them. They go to surgery, you are thinking of surgery, like, and then a rehab process is objective. And understanding if they're fit to go back into duty is also very objective, right? Like, can you, and I don't know all the specifics, but like, can you pass the same physical standards that were required of you before you had the injury? And if you can, you're probably good to go. And if not, then perhaps there's an issue there. And so imagine being able to have like that same level of visibility into mental health. Because as much as we talk about these things as being invisible, they are not. The brain responds differently. It's super visible. It's just we don't have a good way of measuring it. And if you can't measure it, none of those upstream things are possible.
Yeah. Well, you said it early in the discussion about trying to develop the gold standard.
Exactly.
The gold standard in the measurement.
There is no standard right now, and that's a problem. It's not bad standard. It's just there's no standard. Like, to give you one example, so like if you diagnose PTSD the right way right now, you're going to use a long-form diagnostic interview called the CAPS-5. Takes too long. Most people don't use it. So what most people use is what's called the PCL-5, which is not a diagnostic. It's like a symptom severity measurement, but it's just one of these patient self-reported kind of questionnaires. There isn't even a standard cutoff of if the score is above this, it means they have PTSD. You'll find like hundreds of papers and they use different cutoffs, and there's arguments about which cutoff is the best cutoff and this and that. Like that's where we're starting from, is like we don't even really have a common cutoff on the most commonly used tool to diagnose PTSD, which is not a diagnostic, but it's what ends up getting used a lot of the time.
Yeah. It's crazy because people's lives downstream are affected. They're
100%.
affected on, 65% are misdiagnosed in depression. Well, if you've been given that the diagnosis and now you're on drugs, now you've got insurance, you've got work issues, you've got, all sorts of things with family. We need more precision in this. And,
100%.
and I think having that measurement too also allows for a better, broader conversation, a fair conversation around mental health. I think that's amazing. So, we're kind of coming to the end of our time here, which is kind of disappointing to me because this is all very fascinating. But, what does the future look like in the next 5 to 7 years, 10 years, pick your time frame? We got technology moving, AI's moving, you've got different things around, different devices. What are you seeing in this area, and what are you most hopeful for?
Specific to mental health?
Mental health and then your company and you.
Yeah, so I think, obviously, if we're successful, I hope the world looks very different 5 to 7 years from now. And this is kind of, the same way every doctor's visit, you answer, the questionnaires about mental health. And, I would like to see our tool having replaced that. And I think like that for me is like the ultimate measure of success, is can we get to a point where the questionnaires are thrown out and we become kind of the standard thing that every patient everywhere is using for mental health screening and diagnosis. And then I think more broadly in the mental health space, I think there's kind of like two trends that are continuing. The first is kind of the rise of the therapy chatbots, and I have a lot of views on that, but I think someone's going to be successful at it, and it sounds like the FDA is also trying to regulate it a bit more too. But I think it's going to be a more established use for kind of like these things in the middle between like getting no care and getting like a psychologist or a psychiatrist every week. I kind of like call it like a waiting room. So I think things like therapy chatbots, and then like a lot of these digital therapeutics for mental health that are now kind of starting to emerge. Like paratherapeutics was kind of the first shot at that, and I think it worked technically. It was more of a business failure, but there are a lot of companies that are trying that now, and I think we're going to see a much larger rise of that as well, where perhaps when someone's coming into a healthcare system for mental health care, something like Sensei will not just be diagnosing, but you can kind of triage. And then some patients, have to get, immediate care. Some can wait a couple months. Some maybe just need a counselor, not a therapist. And then perhaps like some, will get sent to kind of these digital tools to kind of help either as the intervention itself or as kind of like a waiting room while you wait for the clinician or something. Because I think the one problem that I don't think will be solved in 5 to 7 years is the clinician shortage.
Yeah, this is great. Was there a question or a topic that, we just didn't hit that I didn't ask that is really important for you to get your message out there?
I think we broadly hit it all. We kind of talked about, the three big areas is like the technology, validating in the trials, and then figuring out how to make money on it. And yeah, I think we covered all three. And I think we have a long way to go, but I think as long as our trial goes well and we get us in the market next year, I think there'll be a lot of lives that this will hopefully start to impact positively soon.
Yeah. David, you're amazing. You've got an amazing career ahead of you, and
thank you.
And thank you so much for dedicating your time to this. This is amazing.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.